This research essay critiques how the recommendations of the recently published Treasury report, The Australian Dream, Inquiry into Housing Affordability and Supply in Australia, are out of touch, ideologically motivated, and often dismissive of contrary submissions, while it frequently misrepresents these views. Overall, the conclusions do not logically follow the arguments. The recommended reforms are not only limited in number, but fail to address the structural problems of access to housing and its broader consequences. Effective taxation policy in relation to housing is expected to promote attached consumption of owner-occupation and either affordability or equitable accessibility and security at a minimum. The reality is very different. Housing is needed for basic survival and is therefore protected as a human right, known to intersect with other rights, including safe living conditions. Recently, housing costs, including rents, witnessed the greatest price rises in recorded history, with Australia's 5 largest cities becoming some of the 25 most expensive in the world. Tax has greater utility than just the collection of revenue for the state. Tax can be a powerful tool to achieve social change, particularly for home ownership that is in many ways the foundation to the broader economy. Equity, though contentious in practice, means that each taxpayer should pay their fair share or an equal sacrifice. Equity is so fundamental to the acceptance of any tax system that if there is any other reason to tax, it cannot interfere with this principle. The complexity of the taxation system reduces its transparency, especially where provisions are read and reformed in isolation. Superficially, the tax system is often seen as progressive because it has a marginal tax rate, yet in practice, the effective incidence of tax is sharply uneven, with the poorest workers carrying the burden created by speculators. Following the recommendations of the Reserve Bank of Australia, this essay will take the holistic view of the interoperability between different tax provisions, rather than focus on any single policy. This follows the principle of neutrality that is concerned with the many externalized costs of the system. To explore whether the report's proposals facilitate optimal tax policy, existing policy outcomes will be analysed from their historically situated microeconomic and macroeconomic contexts, evaluated by fundamental tax principles, to then ground amended reforms. The most pertinent tax analysis considered here is the interrelationship between deductions, the capital gains tax, and the capital gains tax discount. The Treasury's housing report has clear conflicts of interest, both political and financial. Submissions favourably treated all aim at reducing the cost of housing at the site of acquisition, through neoliberal reforms such as reducing or removing relevant taxes, levies, regulation, and redistributing more public money into the private coffers of property developers. The underlying assumption is that housing is to be treated purely as capital or a commodity for speculative investment that promotes economic growth. Despite Marxism now being largely reduced to theoretical critique, it remains enough of a threat to be openly attacked and misrepresented. Perhaps because it maintains its power to explain the structures and systems driving these outcomes. Even so much as considering the use value of residential property, simply recognizing that shelter is essential to human survival, is derided as a reductionist outlook, viewing houses as just utilitarian products that provide shelter and nothing else. The report is fixated by the neoclassical assumption that there are simply not enough houses available in the market. While it is true that the Australian population has increased roughly 58% over the last 40 years, Australia has been producing more houses than most other countries in the developed world, with a strong supply per capita by international standards. An average of 52,478 new dwellings have commenced every quarter of the year since December 2013, with a spike of 67,619 in June 2021. Making 1,740,687 new dwelling projects in under a decade. Affordability is not simply a matter of material undersupply. Even if that was so, in contrast to these free market economic justifications, increasing supply is not likely to reduce costs. Access to housing is an issue of distribution. Wealthy speculators typically just increase competition into the marketplace and drive out those on lower incomes. They do not improve supply levels. Instead, all that is growing in this policy environment is the number of unoccupied buildings. Household wealth is largely driven by the rise of prices in land and dwellings. Ostensibly, investing in real estate appears to be low risk, as there are very few outliers in a trend of ever-increasing returns. In just 2 decades, prices rose 51% for all major tenure types, but only 40% for those on a mortgage. The classic speculative strategy is to buy low, sell high to generate capital gains. But even greater income gains can be experienced via rent extractions. Rent often amounts to roughly 2/3 the cost of a mortgage. So the owner needs to only pay the interest rate, which is later deducted as an expense on tax. The process is circular because it facilitates these landlords acquiring more debt for additional rental properties. Speculators necessarily take houses off the purchasing market, increase the renter to owner ratio, drive up housing prices, which then drive up rents, which further incentivizes the whole process to start over again. Moreover, speculators treat housing like a Ponzi scheme when they convince their downline that what they are doing is a secure way to store and grow wealth. Low interest rates and the widespread availability of home loans primarily benefits the already wealthy, and is clearly not the solution when growth in this area is the strongest since 2016. A tight real estate financial nexus has been used to describe not only how housing is unquestionably financialized and commodified, but how central it is to the sector. Commodification is now so deeply entrenched in public discourse that housing connotes debt. The liberalisation, privatisation, and post-industrialisation of Australia's economy in the context of globalisation has resulted in reduced economic complexity, while mortgage debt expanded during this period. Residential real estate comprises $217 trillion, or 200% of global GDP. In Australia, real estate makes up about $7 trillion, or 784% of GDP. Speculation over Australian capital has increased to 23.4% as a proportion of GDP, while the debt to GDP ratio has increased alongside it. Household demand for credit is the highest on record. 94% of 1,012,000 recent home buyers in 2017 to 18 were mortgagees, while 65% were either changeover buyers or acquiring subsequent property or properties. Property speculators retain mortgages, but pay off loans that do not have tax benefits. As Australia privatised its public bank, leaving no public alternative for obtaining home loans, much of this credit is not circulating nationally as per a Keynesian economic model, but contributes to overall foreign debt. Australia must avoid stagflation to maintain its global economic position. It has managed to do this through artificially increasing the value of its currency by fixing the inherently high demand and low supply product of real estate as collateral, not just through the promotion of debt-fueled consumption, but various financial abstractions of this debt. Here, the Treasury avoids the scrutiny of the populace through the simple abstraction, whereby it can sell their labour at increasingly lower rates as a mortgage-backed security on the global marketplace. Workers are disciplined by the credit loaned to them, left unable to protest their own decisions, particularly against the pervasive threat of homelessness. If house prices are rising, it's because someone can afford to pay those prices. Property speculators can reduce their taxable income, while those who are the end users of the property cannot. If the property is used to generate taxable income, then the interest of the home loan can be claimed as a deduction against taxable income. But if an individual buys their own home, it is for a domestic purpose, so they pay their full tax and must pay out of pocket for all of the interest on their loan, repairs, etc. Incurring fewer outgoings, tax minimizing speculators are thereon more willing and able to pay higher prices than home buyers, particularly where they can find renters to pay the principal of their loan repayments. Exceptions, exemptions, and deductions like this undermine the purposes, equity, stability, and overall revenue of the tax system that benefits from broad tax bases. Protecting investors from the consequences of their debt is itself a market distortion. In reform, any deductions that are not repealed should be means tested, quarantined, and then capped, while most should be repaid where capital gains are eventually made. Capital gains treats investors more favourably than productive labour through the 50% discount that is available to investors, which can be combined with the small business relief for a total 75% reduction in capital gains tax. To qualify, the eligible taxpayer must have sold a valuable investment asset after holding it for at least 12 months, explaining why 73.2% of the discount benefits the top 10% of household income and/or high wealth. Capital gains concessions are contrary to the principle of equity because those with the greater ability to pay do not. Put simply, the capital gains tax discount should not just be reduced, but repealed, as it only applies to properties attained for speculative purposes. In comparison, the capital gains tax exemption for primary residents encourages the owner-occupier to maintain and improve the residence for their own immediate, non-financial benefit via attached consumption. Taxpayers who refuse to pay their dues at their designated rate can lawfully reduce their taxable income by essentially hiding their income in a for-profit property asset, known as negative gearing, a popular form of tax minimization. Knowing this, 68% of landlords report a rental loss, with nearly 70% of these reporting a total income of less than $80,000. Negative gearing abuses loopholes in the tax system so that otherwise high-income earners appear less well off, while they hoard residential properties in the process. Contrary to the report's recommendations that favour the interest of real estate firm lobbyists, instead, following the submissions of a significant number of submissions, negative gearing must be abolished. Obviously, in a capitalist economic system, there is a strong correlation between income, wealth, and wealth accumulation. The top 1% of Australian households own 4 or more properties, and 38% of the top 200 richest people in Australia attain their wealth through property. While 1 in 5 households own more than one residential property, 37% are in the top 20% of equivalized disposable household income. These discussions that primarily focus on the issues for prospective property buyers often forget the increasing number of renters that, by definition, outweigh any increase in landlords. House prices impact the cost of rentals, placing the greatest impact of housing affordability on young renters. 57% of renters experience housing stress, defined as spending more than 30% of their total income on housing costs, while only 41% of mortgagees are in this category. This housing stress metric is reductive because it ignores income differentials, masking the pernicious depth of the issue. Notably, there is a rise in homelessness for those squeezed out of both markets. As it currently stands, these urgently needed reforms may fail to pass the political acceptability test without these facts of the situation first being clarified to the tax-paying electorate. After implementing tax policies that prevent speculative practices, any possible deflation to the cost of housing can be seized on to effectively undo much of the damage of privatization. Homebuyers, owners, investors, and renters are far from a monolith with shared interests. Owner-occupation remains the most appealing tenure type for several reasons, not just imputed rents. The capital gains tax discount, when combined with various tax deductions, leads to viewing houses as mere asset commodities, either as a safe storage of wealth or to exploit its inherent scarcity more deliberately for investment purposes. Taken together, what results is an inequitable, regressive tax system that unjustifiably favours the capitalist investor class at the expense of the most material living conditions of workers. This inequity will only be tolerated for so long.